We're live. All right. Today we are with two doctors from across the planet. I have to keep them far away from me so nobody takes me away. We have Dr. Joni Johnston and Dr. Robert King. And I'd love it if you introduce yourselves, starting with you, Dr. Johnston.
I am a clinical and forensic psychologist and private investigator. I do a lot of work in prisons. I do a lot of violence risk assessments. And one of my specialty areas is pretty much where violence and mental health overlap.
Very cool. You write for Psychology Today and have a column there too?
Have a podcast and things like that. So, yeah.
All right. Dr. King.
Hi there. So, yes, I'm not a clinician. I'm a researcher. So, I don't work with clinical patients one-to-one. I tend to train the people that work with them, and I produce students who tend to go off and work in prisons and high-risk psychiatric units, and I do the research that feeds into that. Oh, and sorry, I also have a podcast, and I also have a Psychology Today blog, which is a Hive Mind.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Now, you do have a podcast or don't?
I'm sorry, I should say, yes, no, I'm generating one. Because of the COVID lockdown, I thought I'd try and get a lot of colleagues to do my work for me. And I've set up some interviews with them and they all said yes. So I'm now collating that, but I haven't actually finished it yet.
Okay, so I really am excited to have you guys both together. And I've had both of you on before. It's been a while for Dr. King, but you two really overlap quite nicely. Because I know Dr. Johnston definitely talks about serial killers, but then we can swing over to spree killers with Dr. King, who's done some research on that, and then hybristophiles. So you can't have just the killers. You have to have people who really dig on killers at the same time. So I would love to start out as I wait for questions to come in from the viewers, etc. How would you describe a serial killer, Dr. Johnston?
It's pretty easy. And some people would argue that it's too easy because in 2005, the FBI had a big consortium to try to figure this out. And they pretty much decided that anybody who killed two or more people in two different instances essentially met the definition for serial killer. And the reason for that, I think, was because they wanted to make it as easy as possible for the FBI to get involved in cases to help local law enforcement when they were unable to figure out what they thought was a serial offender. And so prior to that, you had to kind of kill three or more people in separate instances, but they kind of closed that loop. And I think that was good in the sense that, again, it allowed them to get more involved more quickly. But I think the challenge has been that it really does kind of open the door, and you can have people who meet the definition of serial killer who are very, very different from each other, but they still fit the definition of serial killers. Of course, we all think of people like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer as being our prototypical serial killer, but it's really much broader than that.
Well, I wonder then, because I feel like some, quote, spree killers would fit in that definition as well. Like Charles Starkweather, if I recall, he and his girlfriend, and I think that falls into the hybristophile category too, or partner in crime, I'm not sure which, Carol Fugate. I always get them all mixed up. But anyway,
Fugate,
he killed in multiple locations. So that would classify him as a serial killer, but he did it all in one short span. So, Dr. King, how would you classify a spree killer then?
Okay, so I should probably say from the outset that I don't study serial killers directly, but the usual kind of distinction is that for males, the serial killers tend to be. There's a reason why Robert Ressler's book was called Sexual Homicide. He was framing most of the serial killers within the framework of it either being a sexually motivated killing or rapists who are covering up their crimes. And spree killers are very different from that. They might be instigated by some kind of sexual event, but there's no suggestion that there's any kind of sexual satisfaction or sexual release got from the killing itself. So there might be multiple killings, but the spree killers tend to do it in one go, whereas serial killers there is an urge, there is an expression of that urge, and then there's a kind of refraction period. But I'm saying this with a lot of tentativeness because I'm not someone who studies serial. We don't have a lot of serial killers in Ireland. And it's just
Good
not
for
a
you.
thing that I.
Yeah.
So you don't have snakes either, right? No snakes
Right,
for serial
exactly.
killers?
No, and I only became interested in it because a student came to me saying the kind of stuff you're talking to us about is very much the kind of thing that we want to study, and because I come things from an evolutionary perspective, and so that's always looking at it from a potential adaptive advantage, and that's often in terms of what might be of interest to the opposite sex, and that's where the spree killer thing comes in, because it turns out that killers are quite exciting to the opposite sex, and that's an interesting, surprising thing that a lot of people don't know. Not all members of the opposite sex, obviously, but
Sure.
I mean, the reason Ted Bundy got offers of marriage while he was sitting there in the court. You know, there is a subsection of the female population that finds that kind of person extremely attractive, and that's where my interest comes in.
Which is interesting.
I've done a little bit of research on serial killers throughout time, and it was really interesting to learn. And I'm sure you've come across this, Rob, in your research, that has always been the case pretty much. I mean, people will say things like, what's wrong with people today? How could people be getting all these marriage proposals, these serial killers having these groupies that show up in trials and that kind of thing? And then you read about, cases or trials historically, and the exact same thing was going on then.
I have a friend who works in the high security unit in Sweden, and he's often said, look, Rob, if you want to see the most beautiful Swedish women in the world, come over to the waiting room, and that's where they hang out. Now, obviously, it's not all women, but there is an interesting subsection of women that
Let's
find
emphasize that as the only woman here.
Have you found any commonalities among the women who are that way? I mean, are they victims of abuse? I mean, I think I told you I had a pet theory about that in a weird way, if you're going with the Beauty and the Beast or whatever, that you can't get anybody more vile or evil than a serial killer, but you also have them in control because they're locked up, and you can have a relationship with somebody who can't really harm you. So you can have like the ultimate monster that you have some degree of control over. Is there that a possibility or a factor, do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, but you do get people who join in. I mean, you get the Fred and the Rose Wests, you get Ian Brady and the Myra Hindleys, and it would be patronizing to pretend that those women were not instigators and participants in some of the killings. And those people were live. They weren't up. They were active, willing participants. I don't want to make this into a sort of some sort of battle of the sexes thing. Human beings have a history. We've made each other to a large extent, and we're all descended from people who did not all behave particularly well. The Genghis Khan has 5% of the Asian population has got Genghis Khan genes in them. We're all descended from those people. Now, most of us, I think, what's the word? Sublimate those kinds of urges into something that is socially acceptable, is game playing, is consensual, and all kinds of other things. There are some people, and we're not. As a researcher, I have to sort of hold my hands up and say we don't know how this happens. But there are some people, for whatever reason, psychotically cannot do that. I mean, they're not playing games. They're not just reading 50 Shades of Grey. They're not just playing sort of kinky games of an evening. They really want to hurt other people, and they're not interested in whether or not that's consensual. And why they're off the reservation, we are not 100% sure. Is the honest answer. Sorry if that disappoints anyone. But what
No.
I mean, I'm dealing in I mean, this is an interesting comparison because, of course, as an evolutionary psychologist, I tend to deal in universals, whereas as a forensic psychologist, my colleague here is going to deal in individual differences. So there's going to be a very interesting kind of, and that's what evolutionary psychology's blind spot is, individual differences. So it will be about, what are the individual circumstances? What are the developmental circumstances or the earlier life experiences that begins that? And that's not a thing that a lot of Evo Psych doesn't have a lot to say about. Okay, sorry, I've spoken to you.
No. We have comments starting to come in now. And I think this is a valid point here from Eva. I think it would be wrong to concentrate only on killers when talking about mental illness and crime. It creates a lot of misconceptions about mental illness and enhances stigma. Sure.
And
Sure.
that is such an important point, and thank you for making that point, because when you look at, there have been a lot of questions about that, and it's very alarming a lot of times, at least in the United States, when you see somebody who's carried out a mass shooting or a spree killing or a serial killing, and the first thing that you read about is, oh, this person must be mentally ill because they wouldn't be doing this. And we know that in fact is not true. That when you look at some of the studies, only about 4% of violence is linked to mental illness. And certainly when you look at serial killers, the vast, vast, vast majority of them, over 50% of them have never received any kind of psychiatric diagnosis. And of those who have, you're going to find more diagnoses like personality disorders. You're not going to find things like major depression or bipolar disorder or those kind of things. So I really appreciate that point, because we talked about mental illness and violence a little bit at the beginning, and then we kind of segued into serial killers. And I do not in any way want to link the two together, because very rarely are they linked.
And that makes sense.
No, I think that's a very important point. And it does play into this idea that mental health is linked to violence, and obviously most mentally ill people are more likely to be the recipients of violence. Humans have a very hard time addressing this. They have a hard time addressing the fact that violence is a part of human nature. Right? And there's something very compassionate and decent about the fact that we have established the idea of mental illness as a thing which allows people a certain level of compassion and decency. But there is a danger there that we are othering elements of human nature and thinking that certain kinds of things that humans do, such as violent things, are just things that people who are different and other do, rather than being something that a bunch of human beings under the right circumstances can do. I mean, for example, all psychology students have studied Milgram, they've studied Zimbardo, and in every generation it comes on and they try to debunk Milgram and Zimbardo. They go, well, it's not proper experiments, and they weren't conducted properly, and the people in it didn't know what they were doing, and all the rest of it. And you sort of, and whenever I teach this to the students, one of the things I always say is just crack open a history book. Just have a look at a history book. Have a look at the way an English public school or a prison works. You will see behaviors like that being conducted on a day-to-day basis by ordinary, everyday human beings. That's how humans are. They are very bad at facing these features of human nature. Mental illness is often a convenient excuse.
Can you break down the experiments? I know what Milgram is, and I know what Zimbardo is. You're talking about the Stanford prison experiment. And the Milgram experiment, but we probably should say.
In the Milgram experiment, an ordinary everyday person to conduct what they think is torture of another human being. The person is separated by a screen. They have to do a memory test. So every time they get it wrong, you give them an electric shock. And after a certain point, they start screaming for mercy. And it turns out that a very large number of people will carry on delivering the shocks. Now, they're all mocked up, but the person who's delivering the shocks doesn't know that. In the Stanford prison experiment, you get a bunch of ordinary, everyday college kids, stick them in a prison kind of scenario, a simulation, and within a couple of days they start abusing one another. In some cases it became highly sexual. The guys in Bardo who ran it was brought in as a consultant when they had a look at what was happening in Abu Ghraib, and it was exactly the same kind of patterns. Now people come in and as scientists, that's our job. We try and pick apart the components of these experiments. We say, well, it wasn't properly done, or the samples weren't valid or whatever, and that's all fine, but it ignores the fact that if you crack open a history book, you will find examples of all of those things happening right in front of you. Anyone who's been a teacher in a public school in England, because our schools are rather like that in England, anyone who's worked in a prison will see those behaviors on a daily basis. And that's just a thing that humans are not very good at facing. That you don't be a psychopath. You might need to be a psychopath to be Joseph Mengele, but you don't need to be a psychopath to be Joseph Mengele's clerk or his secretary or the person who ran the ovens. Sorry, I go very grim very quickly there. But
I mean, that's fine. And
it's a thing that crops up often,
I wanted to spin out, this is tangentially mental health, but there were some questions about SSRIs, and I didn't know if either one of you had looked into the, I'm going to say correlation because I don't know if it's causal. That's the argument. But SSRIs and especially mass killings. Have you guys seen that?
I definitely would not be the person, I think, to answer that. I know there's been some black box warnings about SSRI is being used with certain populations, particularly younger kids. And I think now they've actually maybe added that warning if you're under 25 in the United States that it may cause an increase in suicidal thoughts or aggressive kind of things. But it's not something that I can personally speak to. I've done a lot of research on.
Sorry, no, I'm afraid I'm the same. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so Prozac.
So often, yeah.
I'm sure there are some cautions to be leveled at the sort of blanket throwing of Prozac of people with a broad spectrum of behavioural problems. But whether or not there's a critical thing, I'm sorry, I'm not the person to ask.
Okay, I just have been reading about it more and more and more that these mass shooters they're finding very often are on one or another, including the Vegas shooter, including Sandy Hook, including one after another and another. And there was that question that has come up about some people just not feeling in it, if that chemistry could be tweaked in a weird way.
Well, serotonin is a regulator of other neurotransmitters. So it's not hard to imagine that if you mess around with its regulatory function, that other neurotransmitters could go off the suddenly be turned up to 11. I'm sorry, I'm floundering because I don't know. Sorry, I'm just speculating. I don't want to. I just
have to bring professionals on here who are acting professional and won't speculate. Jeez, I need to do better next time.
Sorry, I don't prescribe medicines to people. I work with people who do. I would have to go and ask one. Sorry.
Okay, well, something to check out in the future. From the audience, how about the use of mental illness to get rid of unwanted colleagues? And they continue that the military does this all the time.
I think I would need a little more information about that.
Okay.
Sorry, they're asking for advice, or they're asking for.
I'm wondering if you would ever. I'm guessing they're asking if you had ever seen this as a tool, especially because Dr. Johnston, you treat people directly. Are some people, we have HIPAA requirements and things like that, which hopefully prevent this from occurring. But does that sometimes happen?
I think so. Let me just make sure if I'm understanding the question correctly. This is in a job situation. In other words, saying this person is mentally ill and therefore we're going to get rid of them.
Right.
Well, there are all kinds of laws in the United States that would prohibit that. I mean, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, that if you disclose that you have a mental illness, you're protected as long as you're getting treatment and you're not, you're able to do your job. So, that certainly, we could argue about, does that really work, or are there ways to get around that and all that kind of thing? I mean, that would probably depend on a case-by-case basis. But I know that, I've seen many people who have disclosed to an employer that they were, had a certain diagnosis and they needed to get their medication regulated, for example, and needed some flexibility in terms of their time for a little bit of time or whatever. And those are the kind of things that employers generally do, and they should accommodate somebody for. I mean, it wouldn't cover things like if somebody is, engaging in behavior that's dangerous. I mean, for example, you cannot fire somebody in the United States because they're getting treatment for alcohol abuse, but if somebody comes to work and they're drinking on a regular basis, that's different. So this is somebody who's seeking treatment versus somebody whose, substance abuse problem is directly impacting their job and they're not getting treatment. They're two different things.
Okay. And somebody pointed out here, which is interesting, and I would love to parse this a little bit more. There's good books on antisocial disorders and how they're used for that. The U.S. military is more about people with character defects than mental illness. Now, does this bring us back to the question of, I hate to say serial killers? That's a big character defect to have, if you're getting into that. But
well, serial killer, I mean, that's a good thing. And it kind of brings us back to the comment before, that I would like to think, and in theory, we are going to evaluate people in the military, in an occupational setting, in our personal lives based on their behavior as opposed to a diagnosis or personality traits. I mean, at the end of the day, if a serial killer, you have to kill people to be a serial killer. So we're not as concerned about that being a mental health flaw, right? We're concerned about the particular actions that that person is doing. And that's what we're going to focus on. So I'm not aware. I know that, for example, some violence risk assessments for individuals who are getting up for parole will contain an evaluation for psychopathy, for example, because there's a correlation between that diagnosis and violence. But the attempt is to kind of go, okay, the only reason we're using this is because we can show that these particular personality traits and these particular history and these particular behaviors are more likely to result in somebody being violent in the future. So,
question on that. I was told that psychopathy is not an actual diagnosis, that there are other ones.
Yes and no. I mean, it's not. If you get the DSM-5, which is our Bible now, for mental health disorders, it's under antisocial personality disorder, but you can have antisocial personality disorder with or without psychopathy. So it would fall under the category of antisocial personality disorder. But there, for the first time, as a matter of fact, when the DSM-5, it was even acknowledged. So the diagnosis itself has been around for years, used mainly in forensic situations or settings. But now there is at least kind of a place where you can put it. But you're right, you're not going to find psychopathy in the, as a diagnosis in of itself. It's with or without psychopathy in the DSM-5.
Okay, to parse a little more. Go ahead.
Sorry, go on. I don't want to cut across you.
No, please.
So, in terms of behavioral ecology, we measure personality dimensions, and you wouldn't typically call somebody a psychopath. You would measure the components of it. So you'd measure Machiavellianism, narcissism, and lack of empathy. And some people would also argue that there should be sadism as a fourth axis, and that's argued. So if you score high on certainly the first three, what some people call the dark triad, you would be what is commonly known as a psychopath. And that's somebody who, the Machiavellian thing is seeing other people as pawns. The narcissism is seeing yourself as special rules apply to you. And the lack of empathy means that other people's pain doesn't sort of hit you in a moral way. And those kinds of people are typically very bad soldiers. You wouldn't want those people in a unit next to you, because soldiers take very seriously this whole sort of band of brothers idea. I mean, they really will take a bullet for each other.
Sure.
And the sort of person I've just described will not do that. Now, there might be a place for them in the army, possibly, arguably, I don't know, I've never served. But
there's places for everybody.
But they're not the sort of person I'd want next to me in a fight. I mean, that's not a person that I want watching my back, because my back doesn't matter to them. So a lot of these personality tests are interesting because they're interested in those kinds of features. They're interested in the cohesion of a unit, rather than just whether one person is willing to go out and kill people. That's it. I mean, I don't think most soldiers are psychopaths, and I don't think there were attempts to, I think, generate something like psychopathy in soldiers at one point. I mean, there was a deliberate attempt during the 1960s to sort of try and generate that kind of feeling in soldiers.
Or lack of. Yeah.
Oh, boom.
It's not a very successful thing.
You were starting to go down a path, and that was what I was going to ask. And I love words, and I like to understand things. So we bandy about a lot of things like narcissism. You mentioned that. You have antisocial. You have borderline. I know it's asking a lot, but if we could maybe learn just very quickly what these mean. Like, I've always heard that not every narcissist is a psychopath, but every psychopath is a narcissist, as an example. But I don't know if that's right. But can you talk about those different personalities and how they are actually different, or what delineates?
Yeah, who are you after?
I'll go with Dr. Johnston to start.
All right.
So there's a couple of points here before I kind of launch into some of the descriptions, and that is that I think these labels are often overused in everyday life. And I think it's really important to be aware of those, because, I think the great thing about media and social media is that we're all a lot more aware of some of these things. And I think it's important to be able to, evaluate other people, evaluate ourselves, know our strengths and weaknesses. But I think the flip side of that has been sometimes, if I've heard the term psychopath used to describe somebody who would fit that category, the 20 traits would go right down the thing. And I've heard it used to describe somebody, an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend that somebody was mad at or had rejected them or hurt them in some way. And so I think it is important to know that I think those terms, same thing with narcissism or other personality disorders, because when you're talking about, for example, narcissistic personality disorder, that is different from somebody we might call just narcissistic, or this, we all have a healthy degree, hopefully, of narcissism. A self-interest. It's when, we're kind of at the extreme. And so when you're talking about personality disorders, which I'm thinking, Eric, is that what you're talking about when you say, let's define what they are, or just
right? Because we're throwing them around, and I don't think a narcissist is a borderline personality, or maybe they are, or antisocial disorders got these. There's a reason there's different labels. So I'm kind of asking, well, what do they mean?
And Rob, jump in here at any point in time, because there's such interesting research that's going on right now, because I think one of the things we're realizing is that these kind of categories they're not arbitrary, but they're not perfect. And that you can find a lot of overlap when you look at some of the symptoms. And so, a lot of times I see people who are diagnosed with mixed personality disorder, meaning they have features that don't fit into any of these categories. So we're putting them over here because we don't know what to do with them. But a personality disorder, again, is somebody who demonstrates these certain personality traits across settings and across time. Most of the time you're 18 years old before you're diagnosed with a personality disorder, because there's the assumption that until you're 18 or until you're a young adult, you're flying around everywhere. You're a teenager. And some of the behaviors that we see teenagers do, normal experimenting, or even a little bit of rule breaking or getting in trouble, they kind of they're situational. They're not a part of a personality pattern. And so if we were to diagnose somebody who's 15 with antisocial personality disorder, this might be just a transient thing this person's going through. They're going to outgrow that. So that's one of the reasons that we try really hard as evaluators and clinicians to really not diagnose personality disorders, because again, the first thing you look at is this behavior, are these personality traits demonstrated across time and across settings? And are they either causing that person a lot of distress, or they're impairing this person's life in some respects? And so they're pretty extreme when you look at the kind of normal range of behavior. So somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, for example, is somebody who has a couple of different things. And again, Rob, you can jump in here with some of your research that you've done. So they're pretty grandiose in their self-evaluation. They feel entitled. They expect special treatment, even though for no reason. They just think they have impaired empathy. Some people say they have no empathy. I think there's some impairment in empathy there. They're oftentimes manipulative with other people. They're using people to get kind of what they want. It's something again who that oftentimes are very hypersensitive to any kind of criticism. Just a minor criticism might be perceived as just be enraged, might have a rage response because this person's so sensitive to that. So it's really an extreme when you talk about the normal range of human behavior. You want to jump in here?
I mean, sometimes people say things like, they don't know the difference between right and wrong. I can't remember who said this to me. It sort of resonated. So if you think a psychopath doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, wrong them, and see what happens.
I like that.
Well, no, I mean, I can't remember who it was, but also from an ecological perspective, it's human being. I think we have to be comfortable, and I think we're often not comfortable about the fact that some of these are moral judgments. Some of these are value judgments, and some are very uncomfortable about this. They think, oh well, that's not objective, or it's somehow not factual. And I think because if you see it as a disorder, one of the things that somebody might say is, well, the person doesn't feel disordered, and it's perfectly legitimate to say, yeah, but the rest of society feels disordered, and we're allowed to make some adjustments. And can I have just a very brief digression about spiders? I promise you it'll make sense.
Okay.
So
I'm in.
But from an ecological perspective, there's a thing called frequency dependent selection. So there's a type of spider called the Pizarra spider, and like a lot of spiders, the male is very small, the female is very big, and in order to obviate the fact that she will just see him as lunch, he captures a fly, wraps it up in silk, gives it to her before mating, and it's called a nuptial gift. Very, very common across nature. And the female opens up the fly and allows him to mate. But about a number of the male flies are a little bit cute, and they don't bother catching a fly first. They just roll up a bunch of silk, give it to the female, and by the time she's got to the middle of it, he's been and gone. Now this makes the females extremely cross, and they don't trust any males that come along subsequently, and they just eat them. And so what that means is that there are two morphs of male flies. Of male spiders. There's the honest ones who give the fly, and there's the dishonest ones, and they're held in a dynamic equilibrium. And in biology, this is called a frequency-dependent selection. And it means that you can get away with cheating as long as there aren't too many of you doing the cheating. If there are too many of you doing the cheating, then the balance collapses. Now, a lot of us think that that's pretty much what's happening with psychopathy, very broadly conceived, that you can get away with being a cheat as long as there aren't too many of you. If it gets above a certain level, then the people that you're cheating just, the system collapses. And that would seem to fit with the kinds of measures that we have of, very broadly speaking, what we think of as psychopathy, something like between 1% and 5% of the population. That reframes the whole idea of it being a disorder from a biological perspective in different ways. Now, none of that means that it doesn't mean that we should treat it as a disorder. None of that means that we shouldn't treat these people as being dangerous. But it does mean that we are importing a value judgment into, and it also means that we have to think quite carefully about what we mean by mental illness in these circumstances. I mean, is it something a person has, or is it something a person is? Because there's no obvious way we could treat it. And it gets worse, because there is at least some evidence that if you take real hardline psychopaths and you teach them various sort of empathy classes and encounter groups and all the rest of it, it just makes them more effective psychopaths. It means that they can hide. And that's the thing that we have to really take on board as being a potential danger, that we haven't actually addressed the way that they are the way they are. We might just address the way that they present themselves. And those are the kinds of lessons that biology can give. They're not moral lessons necessarily, and they're not what's the word I'm looking for? They're not policy lessons, but they are lessons about what might be achievable. Sorry,
no worries. I've got some chats flying in too. Let me see. When a person is given an MMPI only once, is it a valid test? So first, what is an MMPI?
Basic personality inventory is what that is. It's an old psychiatric test. Is it valid if you do it once? I don't know. I'd have to go and check my books. I'm sorry.
Is that the one where you see horses, or if you see a bear, or what kind of bear it is, and all that stuff, or something?
That's the Rorschach. Yeah, that you're referring to. So we can say a couple of things about it. I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, on the one, it's probably the most widely used personality test, and it isn't supposed to just look at personality traits, but also is supposed to detect depression and anxiety and hypochondriasis and a bunch of other things. So it's basically what it's doing is comparing this person's responses to thousands of other people. Mm-hmm. And so if you're endorsing items a lot more than a lot of other people, then that scale is going to be elevated. So, and of course, there's built in some what they call validity scales. So in other words, if you are, for whatever reason, if you are in a situation where you want to appear, you're really worried about appearing that you're depressed or that you're anxious or whatever, you might, because of your anxiety, deny a lot of things, and even deny things that most people would admit to, like I never get angry. Most people would say false, right? So the questions like that. So there's some validity scales that are built in that are supposed to at least flag and say either it looks like based on this person's responses, they're either maybe trying to be more troubled than they really are, or they're trying to appear to be more virtuous than they really are. So that, and again, but the thing to remember is, so it's not a matter of whether you take the test once or not. It's a matter of being aware that your responses are just compared to thousands of other people who've taken it. So then you have to answer that question, do I think this is valid for me, right? So it's used in all different kinds of ways. It has some pretty good research behind it because it's been given to so many people. They have a lot of norms about it.
I have a crazy question that popped in my head as you were talking about it. I'm very into body language and statement analysis and truth and things like that. But when you said that people are going to act a certain way to maybe seem more like they care more or care less or whatever, a lot of people who conduct tests, even polygraph examiners, which I'm not endorsing a polygraph per se, the really, really smart ones are saying it's not the machine, it's the examiner. And they don't even care what happens with the machine. They're more observing the behavior before the test, after the test, or even walking from the cell to the room. A lot of information may pass. Do you guys have a similar type of situation? This might be more Dr. Johnston because it's clinical, to where you're doing some of your diagnosis around the session versus just what they're telling you right there. Does that make sense?
Yes. And so I'm going to answer it in two ways. When it comes to MMPI, that would be irrelevant only because it's a paper and pencil test that everybody sits down and fills out. So there's not a lot of behavioral evidence that you would see other than somebody's pen and pencil moving back and forth, which everybody does. So you might have a left-handed person or a right-handed person, but that's about it. I do very specific evaluations. So I do evaluations for the parole board and for the prison system and that kind of thing. And so my job is, I mean, obviously when I'm meeting with somebody, and I always meet with that inmate, I'm not only asking him a bunch of questions or her a bunch of questions, the same questions of everybody pretty much, along with some specialized questions depending on the situation. I am, of course, collecting information from the people around him, his treatment team, maybe the custody officer who sees him the most, as well as all of his medical and his legal information, because there are stakes involved when I'm evaluating somebody. This person is wanting to, for example, get out of prison. And so there's no judgment on my part if this person is telling me the truth or not, because I understand that this person wants to get out. I would want to get out too. But what I do, again, my job is to evaluate this person behaviorally, how they're coming across to me, but also to see how that syncs up with all the other information that I have, and to know that ahead of time. So if it's not syncing up, I can give that person a chance to explain why maybe what this person's telling me isn't fitting in with what I've read over here or whatever, because maybe there is an explanation as to why I'm reading this here and this person's telling me this. So it's not so much that I'm not doing a truth analysis, but I'm getting directly by looking at his body language. But I am doing, I guess, a truth analysis in the sense that I'm comparing what he's telling me to all of the history that I have, what other people who are saying who are around him. And then by talking with him and trying to get a sense of if he is telling me or she's telling me something dramatically different from what I'm reading or what I'm hearing, to give that person a chance to explain to see if that makes sense to me.
Yeah, not just truth, though. I meant even just traits. Like, they're answering that question in a particular way. And it could be truthful the whole way, but just the way they're answering can send off triggers of personality traits, for example. Things
right.
Like that.
And I guess, that kind of brings us back to, what is the purpose of evaluation? I mean, I do more evaluating than I do treating. And so, of course, I'm interested in a person's personality, but I'm really interested in his personality as it applies to what is this person going to do in the future. We all have different personality traits. Sure. So I'm going to evaluate, for example, whether I think this person should be released at a certain time, depending upon a lot of other things. But it's not going to be based on his personality traits per se. It's going to be based on a lot of things, such as, does this person have insight into, what's going on? How does this person explain the crime that he's in for? What are this person's parole plans? Where does this person plan to live? If this person isn't been in treatment, does this person think that he needs to continue treatment? What is the evidence? Maybe he doesn't. What is the evidence he needs to be in treatment? I'm going to be looking at very practical things and predictors that we know of either lack of recidivism or recidivism in the future.
Okay, Rob, I imagine that you do some of that research that would help her equate to probabilities of what they may or may not do in the future. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, I'm sorry to disappoint you. No, no, I'm just listening with interest and admiration. No, I have colleagues who do risk assessments of those kinds of things. No, I'm afraid I don't. I'm I'm interested in what makes people sick. I have no insight into what makes them well again. I'm afraid. I was just listening with interest to what you were saying about whether somebody shows remorse, whether somebody shows insight, whether somebody shows actually in many ways quite commonsensical reactions to what might think, if we'd done something horrible, what would we then do? Would we then suddenly go, oh my God, what have I done? Have I realized what I've done? Or am I the kind of person who just goes, yeah. And that's a much tougher job. You're there at the cutting edge. No, I'm very glad to say that I don't have to make any of those kinds of decisions. I live around people who do, but.
Okay, well, while we're talking about deviant personality possibilities in the future, Gavin Stone, and he's actually from England, so not too far from you, Robert. And he's a member. So, folks, be a member on the channel. You'll definitely get priority and behind the scenes things, stuff like that. His question is, I thoroughly enjoyed the TV series Dexter. I confess I've never watched it. I read the book. It was dreadful. I'm sure you've heard of it. Do you find that most serial killers justify their actions, or are the majority purely for pleasure?
You go first, please.
That is such a great question on so many different levels. I have listened to hours and hours of confession tapes. And one of the things that kind of amazes me is that you would think, or I guess I would think intuitively, that if somebody had killed multiple people, they really wouldn't care what other people thought of them in terms of, when they're talking to law enforcement or an attorney. And these are not people who are going to get out. So these are not people who are at this point trying to influence law enforcement to release them. And what's interesting is how often you do hear individuals who have either been convicted, will never get out of prison, or are about to be convicted, and the evidence is overwhelming and they know it, or even if they're pleading guilty, how often that person will kind of justify what they've done in some way. And it can be in a lot of different ways. It can be by blaming the victim in some respects. It can be by blaming law enforcement for not catching them. It can be blaming society. It can be a lot of, but it's just kind of amazing how often that happens. And I wonder, and we don't know this for sure, at least I don't know this, we wonder, when you have a serial killer who also is married and seems to be operating and compartmentalizing things like a BTK family or whatever, I wonder sometimes if some of the thinking and rationalizing that we hear, like in an interview, if that goes on internally and helps kind of justify how I can keep this part of my life over here and this part of my life over here. I'll never forget, I was listening to Samuel Little's confession. He was the most prolific serial killer that we know of in the United States, who recently, confessed to 96, I think, or 98 murders. And initially they thought he was just, exaggerating, get attention, or they've confirmed many of them. And, some of the things he says, he was talking about one of his victims and talked about how she really wanted to die. And there's just no evidence. He almost explains like a mercy killing. And you're kind of sitting here listening to this, and I know the facts because I've read, a lot of the evidence and that kind of thing. And you're kind of going,
is that the fantasy? Don't they have a lot of them have a strong fantasy thing that they're putting together, and maybe he's projecting that too? No,
I think the fantasy part for him, clearly he had a paraphilia. He had he was a sexual sadist, basically. I mean, he really got a lot of sexual pleasure out of strangling women, and it reported this kind of fetish for women's necks from an early age. And again, there seems to be some documentation of that. So I think the fantasy part of it, Eric, was kind of a separate thing for him, which he was very, very happy to talk about at length. His fantasies, right? Sexual fantasies, and how he lived those out. it seemed different in the explanation as to why why this particular victim. At one point he said, I really think this victim and I would have been friends if this hadn't happened. And just some of the things he said, if you didn't know what he had done and you didn't know the evidence that clearly was contradictory to what he said, it seemed almost believable. And yet, I heard another healthcare serial killer who talked about God calling her to basically murder these patients of hers. And yet the way she described it, or the way the evidence suggested, is that she basically picked people that were difficult. They were difficult patients. And she had made a lot of negative comments about these patients who had dementia. So some of them were behaviorally difficult because of their advanced stage of dementia. But she had made numerous comments about how difficult they were. And she really took it personally that these patients were being difficult, even though they had this advanced dementia. And yet she's sitting here talking about these messages from God, and there was clearly no indication at all that she had ever gotten any message at any point in time. She never had any psychosis, nothing. And so it is interesting that you do see sometimes serial killers who feel a need to present a certain front, even when they've done these horrible things and everybody knows it.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that it's not just they want to make sense to the outside world; they need to make sense to themselves. And there are some people. There's some serial killers have written books. Ian Brady wrote a book called the Faces of Janus. Albert Fish's works are available. If you want to read them, I'll warn anyone now. I mean, it's like wading through a sewer. I mean, if you want to read about a guy who ate children and then wrote to the parents, with recipes. I'm not making. This is Albert Fish. I mean, you are wading through a sewer if you read this guy's works. But he was trying to make sense to himself. Ian Brady, similarly, there are pages and pages in Ian Brady's book where he goes on about the fact that morality. It's all very sort of first year undergraduate philosophy stuff. He goes on and on about how morality is a trick that's played on the strong by the weak. It's all very sort of sub-Nietzschean stuff. There's no such thing as morality. It's all relative. And then he spends the next few pages going on about how the guards are mean to him and how they don't have a right to do that.
Except when it comes to guards, yeah.
I mean, in some ways, it would be laughable. I mean, it is, in some ways, it's laughable, except that, what Ian Brady did, and this makes sense in his own head. Yeah. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning twirling their moustaches going, ha, I'm evil. What will I do today? It makes sense to them. And yeah, if people want to read this stuff, I invite them to do so. It's interesting in a way, but you'll come away wanting to have a wash.
Okay, I have more coming in here, and this one definitely for Rob. I was recently made aware of the association that violence has with lead poisoning. Would be interested in the guest comments if they are aware of it or how that might relate to irrational thinking. And I have definitely heard the biggest studies coming out.
Yes. Now, that was this is taking me back to the last time I was at a conference about this, and we haven't done any conferences for a while. And a couple of my colleagues in anthropology were sort of taking me aside and were showing me the data on this, and it does look very interesting. I can't. The truth is, I can't make up my mind about it. It does look like there are some interesting correlations between the removal of lead in petrol. Do people know all the story? Do they know the sort of the Thomas Midgley story? Is that?
No, I've just heard that. What I've read about it, and I could be wrong, is that there's been big questions about what's caused the huge crime drop throughout the United States, especially in the 90s to the 90s was almost like the peak, and then it started to plummet all over. Yeah. So then there were questions about Freakonomics. They said it was abortion. Yes. And that the unwanted got aborted, so they weren't committing crimes, and that was their theory. There was obviously more of the crime bills and things like that were speculated on.
That kind of stuff, yeah.
Right, and then, but there were others who were saying, "Well, wait a minute, you had New York drop, but you have different jurisdictions where one would drop more than the other, but the population centers." Or the crime procedures, the way law enforcement worked or whatever, were different. So And that's where they started to kind of get into this weird lead poisoning, because where most of the crimes occurred, there also was the most pollution from lead-based cars.
Yes.
Again, it's correlation.
Some
but
people
I
have
don't know.
suggested that explains all of too. There is this suggestion that it was the lead in the water pipes that sort of brought about the sort of collapse of the Roman Empire. I've had a couple of anthropology friends take me aside and show me the data on this, and I've got to have to confess, it's a couple of years ago. I remember at the time thinking, "Oh, this is really interesting. Somebody needs to follow this up." But I'm sorry, I never did. I'm aware it's one of the competing hypotheses alongside the broken windows one and the selective abortion one, and yeah, it's certainly worth investigating. There's definitely an effect of that. I mean, there's no question that lead in the environment causes various kinds of damage to very specific bits of the brain, particularly the kinds of bits that you really want civilization to have, like the frontal lobes. So but whether or not that's the causal thing for violence, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm sorry you caught me on the hop there.
Yeah,
No worries.
I don't know that I could add anything other than to say that, and this has nothing to do with lead poisoning, but it does have to do with brain damage. And we do know that there's a history of head trauma, up to a third. When you look at, up to a third violent offenders have had a history of head trauma. I am often blown away by that. I have to say, I've been working in prisons for many years now, and I am astonished at the number of times I run across somebody who had a head injury that resulted in hospitalization or loss of consciousness or whatever, and it's documented. So the person isn't saying that because they're trying to get away with something. So we know that when you damage certain parts of the brain, or when you have a head injury, or especially the frontal lobe, it can result in all kinds of changes, including personality changes.
How does that compare with
This is
a
where the breaks
baseline
are.
of non-prisoners? I mean, what's the average population head injury scale versus the incarcerated head injury scale? Because that would probably be a factor, right?
That's a good question. I'll have to look that up, but I can tell you it's significantly more. I know.
Okay.
I mean, a third of the population does not have a history of head trauma. I can tell. I mean, I did a neuropsych internship years ago, and so I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it is not anywhere close to a third.
Okay, very, very interesting.
Yeah, we're talking about accelerators and brakes, aren't we? So you've got a bunch of stuff with the amygdala, which is the accelerator. Aggression and all the rest of it, and you've got a bunch of in the frontal lobe, which is the brakes. And either one of these things, there's a thing called Kluver-Bucy syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of this, where you have damage to the amygdala and you have damage to the frontal lobes, and that results in all accelerator, no brake. And people with Kluver-Bucy syndrome do things like they try and have sex with bits of the pavement, for example. If you have a cat with Kluver-Bucy syndrome, it will try and have sex with dogs. I mean, and I mean, the reason I say this is because that's the sort of
Is that similar to that rat disease that cats have that make rats aggressive and not afraid of cats?
Yeah, that would be damage to the frontal lobes. That would be frontal lobe damage. And I'm simplifying things enormously, but you've got sort of a push and a pull thing in the brain, and so you've got an urge to do stuff, and an inhibitor. I mean, I'm at the risk of sounding Freudian here. You've got an id and a superego, and you can, either one of those things can get damaged or sort of hypertrophed in one way. And the frontal lobes are very, very broadly the brakes, and things like the subcortical structures are very, very broadly the accelerators. And if you look at the brains of have you seen that TED talk? I've forgotten the name of the chap now. I'm sorry. His name's gone out of my head. You might have had him on your show. The guy who was doing the
Dr. Fallon.
Yes,
Dr. James Fallon. Yes, he's been on twice, including the live stream. So everyone subscribe. Get cool people.
So he was doing exactly this. So you look at the brains that he was describing, and there was a load of activity in the subcortical structures, and there was a minimal activity in the frontal lobes, and that was pretty much what he was describing in all of those people. That's what I'm talking about with an accelerator and a brake. And damage to the frontal lobes is damage to the brakes, basically, isn't it? And so anything else that sort of exacerbates that is going to be potentially problematic for the rest of society. But anyway, that's right, Jimmy Fallon. If you've had him on the show, then he's explained this in far more detail than I will.
Yeah, I'll have to come back with you guys. more from the audience. I don't know if this is, it's sort of a question. I don't know if it's a question or a statement. It's kind of a, overall, is it a coward that makes a serial killer? Many people were abused, but don't kill. Also, they often kill lone women. If they were truly brave, wouldn't they choose huge males as victims?
So a couple of things here. Rob, you were saying earlier that when we look from a societal point of view or an evolutionary point of view, it's hard to know exactly what causes serial killers, in our society. And unfortunately, the same is probably doubly true trying to look at one individual or a small group of individuals, because you're absolutely right. The audience is absolutely right. That for every, we know, for example, that you find a significant number of serial killers have a history of abuse, right? Childhood abuse. That's been documented over and over again. And yet we all know individuals who have been abused, some horribly, who did not become serial killers. As a matter of fact, they not only did not become violent, they might have become advocates or had more empathy for other people. And so it's so puzzling, why did this one person turn out this way and most other people kind of go in a different direction? And so we still don't know the answer to that question. There's some, the theory, and it's not even a theory, the guess is that it's a perfect storm that creates. So, for example, you have somebody who has some kind of genetic vulnerability or some kind of, whether it's inherited or a temperamental thing, or maybe there's some, we don't know. There's some inherited vulnerability. Maybe it's a temperament, and then you have a history of abuse in the, in the family, or abuse growing up. And then you have all these other things. Then you have these life experiences when the person, is in elementary school and adolescence. And then you have some kind of, deviant sexual preference that develops if you're talking about a sexual serial killer. And then at some point they have a trigger as an adult that starts this kind of murderous spree, even though this person has been fantasizing about it for years. That's when you're talking about a sexual serial killer, that's our best guess. So I wish we could say, and I hope we get to the point where we can say, here's the recipe for a serial killer, so we can now make sure that the ingredients are missing, right? That the person, we're going to take away these ingredients so this doesn't happen again. We're still trying our best to kind of figure that out. So we can talk about, this group is more likely to have this life experience. This group is more likely to have a learning disability, for example, in comparison to other children. Most people who have a learning disability do not ever become, violent. So that's the thing. It can never, there's no such thing as I am a murderer, a premeditated murderer because they had this life experience, because you can find thousands of people with that same life experience who never chose that path.
Definitely.
Sure.
Definitely.
It could be also that the question is asking, and it's an issue I've occasionally sort of stumbled across. You do get people idolizing these kinds of killers, and the question might be sort of trying to cut that off at the source and go, well, these people are not admirable. And I think there is something to be said about the idea that some people get it into their.
What are they idolizing,
sort of,
though? Can we stop on that for a second? Are they idolizing the strength? Or what?
There's idea of sort of a Nietzschean Superman who's sort of seen through morality and seen through that morality is all a fake. And you do get this with some people. You'll get this idea that somehow this person has seen the reality, and the reality is that there's the strong and the weak, and the strong get to prey on the weak, and all these people who don't see this as sheep. Sometimes these people read a few too many Ayn Rand books. I'm sorry, I'm wearing my heart on my sleeve here. I don't think Ayn Rand is a particularly good philosopher. And I'm not saying she's encouraging serial killers. I just, I don't think she's a particularly good philosopher.
Well,
and sometimes they sort of go down this route. And also an insincerity. She lived most of her life on Social Security, and not that there's anything wrong with that. There's a falseness to it. But I think sometimes people get it into their head that somehow morality is all a fake, and I think that's a very dangerous route to go down, because I'd invite people to go and read Albert Fish's book, go and read Ian Brady's book. If you think that person really is morally and intellectually strong, then I'll have a philosophical argument. Well, we won't do it in terms of psychology. I'll just sit down and do the whole Aristotelian bit, see if your ideas make sense. there's an intellectual weakness about people who do this. Sure. I mean, I think that might be what the questioner was getting at.
The other thing, I'm sorry, Rob, I didn't mean to cut you off there. The other thing
fire away.
The other thing I was going to comment on is, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is amazing. I've never researched a serial killer or heard of a serial killer who said, I want a challenge in terms of my victim. Serial killers prey on people weaker than they are. So I think that does attest to their mentality. It's not going to be like, I want to even match here. I'm going to meet somebody who's my physical strength, my physical size. We're going to meet on the pitch. We're going to duke it out and see who wins. Oh no, it's going to, I'm going to kidnap this person who is, weighs, 80 pounds less than I do, who's, walking along at night and, isn't expecting anybody to get to grab her. And, even female serial killers tend to pick children, for example. So, or we find people who are killing patients who were sick. One of the consistent things we do find with serial killers is they are cowardly in that respect. They have no interest in testing their physical prowess or for sure. They're going to win and they're going to stack the deck in their favor. There was a serial killer out of Alaska whose name is
Israel Keys.
No, Robert.
Anyway,
the Hunter.
The Most Dangerous Game.
The Hunter, yes. Yeah. I mean, that is kind of a dramatic example. This is somebody who literally was a big game hunter. He actually won a couple of trophies or set a couple of records for big game hunting. And he would literally kidnap these women and he would take them to his house and rape them and torture them to some extent. And then he would fly them out on his plane.
Robert Hansen, thank you. To this part of the wilderness.
And he would oftentimes blindfold them. Their hands are tied behind their back. This is a territory he has hunted and knows this is this is what you're hunting. I mean, what kind of it's just kind of the epitome of somebody who's not really interested in any kind of sense of fair play or anything like that. It's, I'm going to make sure that I have every advantage and that I can track you down and have complete control over you.
And I have to tell you a horrible coincidence before we go on. Do you know who the worst traitor to the United States in the world of espionage was outside of Aldrich Ames? Another Robert Hansen. Same name. Two wins instead of one. We have time for one more question, and I want to give it to a member because I know we've a hard out. It's late in Ireland right now. And most people might ask, what is the most common trait or attribute among killers? My question is, what is the trait or attribute that a killer never has?
Well, kindness. I mean, killers aren't kind, are they? Unless
is that true? Or are they compartmentalized? Are they sometimes? I mean, Hitler loved dogs.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, he didn't kill himself, did he? He was famously quite squeamish, wasn't he? But maybe he's not a very good example.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe he's not a psychopath directly. I don't know. Dickinson and Milgram.
I don't think he was a psychopath. I don't see any other evidence of him being one. That's an interesting question.
Gavin's good for them.
The only thing that comes to mind for me, and again, we're talking about assuming we're talking about premeditated murder, because of course most murders kind of occur in the heat of the moment, and I don't think would necessarily fit in this category. But if you're talking about premeditated murder, the only thing I can say is lack of empathy toward their victims. So I think that there's oftentimes a lack of empathy across the board, depending upon who you're talking about, or talking about a serial killer, for example, there can be a lack of empathy across the board. But I do think there have been serial killers who have the capacity for empathy in some small areas of their life. But what you do see is this lack of empathy and this dehumanization toward the victim. That, I very rarely have read about anybody who ever feels remorse toward that person. They have somehow separated themselves out. This is not really a person to me for whatever reason. And that's the one thing that I do have seen over and over again.
And that's very scary, isn't it? Because it's the evidence is dehumanization is something that normal human beings can do. We don't most of the time, but it's a capacity that most of us have. And if we don't, it's usually an effort of will. It's difficult not to. It's a really interesting question. I think that's quite a dangerous.
It's a perfect last question, isn't it?
Well, it makes a lot of us think, well, there but for the grace of God. I don't think there but for the grace of God we could all be serial killers. I do think that more humans than would like to admit it to themselves could be killers, though. I don't. I think it's just surprisingly easy to flick. But that wouldn't necessarily turn everyone into a serial killer, but it could turn people into killers.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, people feel revenge, for example. I mean, people who haven't felt a sense of vengeance do not realize just how easy it is to provoke that, in an ordinary, everyday human being, and that's quite scary.
Well,
that's
folks,
a terrific question, though.
Yeah,
yes, it is. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up, folks. I hope you really enjoy this. Please smash that like. I'm trying to get the YouTube terminology down. I'm not perfect at it. And if you enjoy this, like these kind of guests, please subscribe. Joni, where can people find you?
Wow, my website is drjonijohnston.com, and you're more than welcome to visit my Psychology Today blog, which is called The Human Equation. And the last plug I'll give is my podcast, which is called The Forensic Psychologist.
Oh, you're hiding it. You have a YouTube channel. You're on a YouTube thing right now.
Unmasking a Murderer. Yes.
Okay. So definitely check that out. Wow.
I've recently gone on Twitter with some reservation. So I'm Rob King, psychologist at UCC. I'm available on Twitter, and I've had a Psychology Today blog for a while, which is called Hive Mind at Psychology Today, which is where I'm very happy to engage people on that. I'm like I said, I'm slightly more dubious about Twitter because it doesn't feel like it feels like people's throwaway comments rather than people's considered comments. But I could be wrong about that. I could change my mind.
It's fast, and it's good for that. So
thank you very much. Anyway, thanks for the question.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for the audience. There were some great questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
This is fantastic.